Good evening. Welcome to Marquis Mondays, a project of the Lafayette 200 Bicentennial. My name is Kathleen Hood, and I will serve as your host this evening. The Marquis de Lafayette was a daring young Frenchman who sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to America in 1777 to join the fight for freedom in the War of Independence. Our 6-month Marquis Monday series will explore just how Lafayette's extraordinary life inspired a variety of individuals who authored books related to this American hero. Tonight, we are fortunate to feature a well-known author and speaker, Alan Hoffman, who wrote the book Lafayette in America in 1824 and 25. During Alan's program, we invite you to submit any questions you might have by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time permits. And now we are honored to welcome Mr. Chuck Schwam, the Executive Director of American Friends of Lafayette and organizer of the Lafayette 200 Bicentennial Initiative, who will introduce our special guest author. Chuck, welcome to our Marquis Monday Kickoff.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's an honor to be here. And again, my name is Chuck Schwam, and I am the Executive Director of the American Friends of Lafayette. And we've been around since 1932. The American Friends of Lafayette were born at Lafayette College, and we boast over 1,500 members across the country. In fact, we've tripled in size as of late because Lafayette has come back. We're following Lafayette's footsteps exactly as it happened in 1824 and 1825. So when Lafayette is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in July of 2025, we'll be there celebrating that bicentennial right next to Kathleen. Lafayette was here for 400 days. He traveled 6,000 miles, and Lafayette saw over 4 million people. He was only supposed to stay for 3 months, but he ended up staying for 13 months. And that's because everybody wanted a piece of Lafayette. Lafayette was America's first rock star. 90,000 people saw Lafayette land at Castle Clinton on August 16th, 1824. Only 6,000 people came to see the Beatles. Lafayette's we saw all 24 states that were in existence in the United States, and we will also be in all 24 states. We currently have over 250 events planned, and as we celebrate, commemorate, and educate the public about three important things. Number one, history is important. Don't get me wrong, math and science are important too, but all the questions about the future can be answered simply by looking in the past. Number two, we want to educate people about the Franco-American alliance. Without the French, we would have never won the American Revolutionary War. This is a long-time relationship. We've been allies for over 240 years, one of our closest friends. Number three, about Lafayette, not only as a young soldier who came to our aid in the 18th century, but also as a man who came back in the 19th century as an abolitionist, as a feminist, as a friend of Native Americans, as an environmentalist, as an advocate for penal reform, as a staunch supporter of freedom of the press, as a human rights champion. These are things that were important then, and these are important now. And we're traveling around the country, just as Lafayette did, teaching Americans about these ideals. Please follow us on Lafayette200.org for where we'll be next. Now, I'd like to introduce my boss, Alan Hoffman, and I'm going to read his bio for everybody to hear. It's quite impressive. Alan R. Hoffman, JD, obtained his BA in history from Yale, where he studied under Professor Edmund Morgan before earning a JD at Harvard Law School. He practiced law in Boston for 50 years. An avid reader of early American history, he discovered Lafayette in 2002 and spent 2 years, 2003 to 2005, translating Auguste Levasseurs' Lafayette in America, 1824 and 1825, the first-hand account of Lafayette's farewell tour of America, written by his private secretary. This translation was published in 2006 and is in its third printing. Hoffman has lectured widely in Lafayette, over 200 talks, and has spoken in each of all 24 states Lafayette visited and Washington, D.C., which Lafayette also visited during the farewell tour. He has written scholarly articles about Lafayette, including The Marquis de Lafayette in Savannah and Lafayette's Anti Slavery Lament, Revisited. Hoffman has also co-produced and was the principal author of virtual travelogues covering Lafayette's farewell tour visits to 4 states: New York, Virginia, North Carolina, and New Hampshire, with Travel Stories GPS. Hoffman is an officer of 2 Lafayette Society. He currently serves as president of the American Friends of Lafayette and the president of the Massachusetts Lafayette Society. He is also the editor of the Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette, and he has been designated a scholar in the New Hampshire Humanities to Go program. It is my great honor to introduce my boss, my friend, Alan Hoffman.
Uh, Thank you very much, Chuck. I really appreciate the introduction, and I also want to thank Kathleen for organizing this wonderful series of speakers that she has done. And I think you're going to thank Kathleen as well, because she gave me a time limit. My reputation has preceded me, so I'm on a strict quota of time here, but I'll try to do my best. This talk is called A Farewell Tour Primer. In 1846, Ensigns and Thayer of New York published a colored broadside entitled Pictorial History of the United States. First slide, please, Kathleen. In addition to depicting the seals of each of the states, which you can see, and the territories, which you can see around the perimeter, and printed information about the discovery of the Americas, the battles of the Revolution and the War of 1812, population statistics from 1790 and 1840, and a list of distinguished men. This print contains images of 3 figures below the title, Pictorial History of the United States. Washington in the middle, Franklin to his left, and on his good right hand, Lafayette. Not Jefferson or Madison or Adams or Jackson or Hamilton, but a Frenchman, Lafayette, under the title with those 2 great Americans, Pictorial History of the United States. Why was that? In the 19th century and well into the 20th, Lafayette's reputation in America was extraordinary. He was already popular before his arrival in 1824. He was popular by virtue of his important role in the American Revolution, his subsequent activities on behalf of his adopted land, America, his close friendship with George Washington, and his storybook life. However, this trip, during which he toured each of the 24 states and was treated as a conquering hero, reaffirmed his reputation and elevated him into iconic status. The best analogies that I could think of, and Chuck referred to one of them, is the Beatles tour of the 1960s. And the reaction of teenage girls in particular to the Beatles visit, or the 1979 visit to America of Pope John Paul II. The result was that Lafayette's name was firmly imprinted on the American psyche. When state banks printed legal tender in the 1830s and 40s, Lafayette's face appeared on bills in more states than any other person except George Washington, and sometimes they both appeared on the same bill. Scores of counties, cities, towns, and townships, actually 80 in total, were named either Lafayette, Fayette, Fayetteville, Lafayetteville, or LaGrange, the name of the chateau that he lived in from 1779 to 1834. Kathleen, the next slide, please. That's the north view of the Chateau LaGrange. There is even one LaGrangeville. New York State has towns with each of those 6 names honoring Lafayette. There are also countless streets, squares, and parks named for Lafayette. There are 8 streets named for Lafayette in the city of Boston and 12 in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Numerous statues and monuments were built to honor Lafayette. The first one I'll show you, next slide, please, is Daniel, and it's my favorite, Daniel Chester French's Lafayette Monument, which stands in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. After France gave America the Statue of Liberty, America reciprocated. An equestrian statue of Lafayette by an expatriate named Paul Wayland Bartlett was given to France in 1908. It was called the Children's Statue because it was paid for by coins collected by hundreds of thousands of America's school children. It stood outside the Louvre until the I.M.Pei pyramid was constructed in the early 1960s, and it was then moved to a much less conspicuous spot on the right bank of the Seine. The next slide, Kathleen, is the children's statue. An exact copy of that was constructed near the State House in Hartford, Connecticut. There's a fun story about that. The government, when they set it up first, the rear of the horse was facing Ella Grasso's window, and she instructed that it be removed and replaced so that the Lafayette's face and the horse's face was facing her. I'll show you one more statue. This one is, Kathleen, you can show this. This one is Lafayette clasping the hand of Washington. It was by Bartholdi, the sculptor of the Statue of Liberty, and it can be found in Lafayette Square on the southern tip of Morningside Park in Manhattan. Mount Lafayette was named by the good people of Franconia, New Hampshire in 1824. Lafayette College in eastern Pennsylvania was named for Lafayette in 1826. There's a Lake Lafayette in northern Florida and the Lafayette River in southern Virginia. Now, Lafayette decided to return to the United States one last time after he received an invitation by his old friend, James Monroe, in early 1824. In July, he departed for America with his son, George Washington Lafayette, with Auguste Levasseur, his private secretary, who kept a journal of the trip, and a valet aboard the Cadmus, which was an American packet ship or commercial ship. This trip, the farewell tour, was a unique event in our history, if not the history of the world. Now, you may think that what I just said is hyperbole. However, I'm not alone in expressing this opinion. Lafayette's contemporaries felt that way about it. In 1830, Edward Everett wrote a review of Lafayette in America in 1824 and 1825, Lafayette's secretary's firsthand account of the farewell tour in the North American Review. In it, he praised the book, Lafayette and the Farewell Tour. About the latter, he wrote, an event taken in all its parts, unparalleled in the history of man. Here is this 67-year-old man, tall but somewhat portly, who walks with a limp and a cane and wears a hairpiece, who has wielded no military power or governmental authority since 1792, when he served as a general in defense of France, who then held no public position at all in either country, and he is treated like a conquering hero or a Caesar or an Alexander for 13 months in every corner of a vast country. There are parades, militia reviews, dinners, banquets, balls, meet and greets with school children, the public, and members of private societies. There are dedications of public monuments and buildings, and a plethora of speeches and toasts. Triumphal arches are constructed to honor Lafayette in large cities, large and small, and towns and townships. Americans of all races, each gender, and of every age wanted to touch this man who they felt had done so much for their country. A whole cottage industry of consumer goods was created around Lafayette and the farewell tour. There are Lafayette prints, fans, hats, buttons, bandanas, medallions, sheet music, bottles, brushes, baby shoes, ribbons. I'll show you a Lafayette ribbon, Kathleen. The next slide. That's a Lafayette ribbon. worn by the school children of Boston in 1824. The next slide, Kathleen, is a Lafayette scarf manufactured in Philadelphia in 1824. There are Staffordshire and other ceramics, including a set of dishes depicting Lafayette's arrival in New York City. We'll see one in a couple of minutes. And ladies and men's kids' gloves with his face imprinted on them. The next slide, Kathleen, is some Lafayette gloves. And the one on the right, he's paired again with George Washington. Numerous American painters wanted to, and many did, paint him from life. For example, Samuel Morse of New York painted the painting in the next slide. He won the competition of the city of New York, and that is now in the City Council chamber in New York City. And Thomas Sully painted Lafayette outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The next slide is the Sully painting. On June 15th, 1824, the Cadmus arrived in New York Bay. As Levasseur contemplated Staten Island to his left, he writes, "The noise of a cannon caught my attention from another side. It was the artillery of Fort Lafayette, which was announcing the arrival of the Cadmus to the city of New York." The next slide is a wonderful painting of the only painting that I've come across of the Cadmus. It's in the collection of the Penobscot Maritime Museum in Maine. Because it was a Sunday, Lafayette disembarked in Staten Island and stayed at the home of Vice President Daniel Tompkins. Now, on the following day, he left Staten Island to a gun salute from Fort Lafayette. The next slide is a 19th century painting. That structure in the water that you can see is Fort Lafayette. It was destroyed in about 1960 to make way for the Verrazano Narrow Bridge connecting Brooklyn to Staten Island. On that day, on the 16th, he arrived at Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan on a steamship, the Chancellor Livingston, accompanied by a numerous flotilla of boats, and was welcomed by all the military and civilian authorities of the city. And according to Levasseur, a crowd of 200,000. The estimates ranged from 50 to 200,000. The next slide is the ceramic that I mentioned, the landing of Lafayette. You can find these. They're fairly common. It was made in 1824, 1825. And the next slide is what Castle Garden looks like today. It still stands. It was a circular fort. And when Lafayette, in a moment, I'll briefly mention the fete that was held in it in September. In any event, having been feted in New York City, Lafayette headed for Boston on August 20th, 1824 on the Old Post Road. He arrived in Roxbury, a near suburb, a little after midnight on the 24th, having stopped in many cities and towns in Connecticut and in Providence, Rhode Island. On the morning of the 24th, he headed to Boston from the Shirley Eustace House in Roxbury in a procession of 70,000. He crossed the Boston Common to the State House, where he was addressed by Governor Eustace and replied. He was then escorted to apartments that the city alderman had prepared for him, sparing no expense. I talk about these apartments because it shows the lengths that cities, towns, and even small cities and towns went to welcome and honor Lafayette. The backstory to the apartments where Lafayette stayed from August 24th to September 2nd is beautifully told in an exhibition catalog called Rather Elegant Than Showy, The Classical Furnish of Isaac Vos. To summarize, the alderman rented a portion of the Amory House at 22 Beacon Street, right a catty corner from the State House, and gorgeously furnished it. As the authors write, the city of Boston hired only the most respected craftsmen for the furnishings. Vos and Sons for furniture and lighting, and Hedges for upholstery, draperies, and carpeting. Consistent with this high standard, they also selected the city's leading gilder and looking glass maker, John Doggett. He billed the city for a loan of 2 pairs of looking glasses, 1 pair valued at an extraordinary $425. The Vos furniture consisted of 78 items, including the next slide, this beautiful rose wood couch, which was on exhibit at the Massachusetts Historical Society in 2018. Mr. Doggett also provided 5 Gilbert Stuart paintings, one of each president, so that Lafayette could be with his friends while he stayed in Boston. Moreover, the city hired a barouche with 4 white horses for Lafayette's use. In the afternoon of the 24th, there was a dinner at the Exchange Tavern. According to the local press, Lafayette visited John Hancock's widow at her home in the evening. The visit is memorialized in Louisa May Alcott's An Old-Fashioned Girl. While this is a work of fiction, the story has a ring of truth to it, and its veracity is supported by the familial relationship between Alcott's mother, Abby May Alcott, and Madame Hancock. They were both Quincy's. In this story, a grandmother describes Lafayette's visit to her grandchildren and a friend of theirs. Well, by and by, the general, escorted by the mayor, that's Mayor Quincy, drove up. Dear me, I see him now, a little old man in nankeen trousers and vest, a long blue coat and ruffled shirt, leaning on his cane, for he was lame, and smiling and bowing like a true Frenchman. As he approached, the 3 ladies rose and curtsied with the utmost dignity. Lafayette first bowed to the governor's picture, then to the governor's widow, that's Governor Hancock, and kissed her hand. That was droll, for on the back of her glove was stamped Lafayette's likeness, and the gallant old man kissed his own face. Then some of the young ladies were presented, and as if to escape any further self-salutations, the Marquis kissed the pretty girls on the cheeks. Yes, my dears, here is just the spot where the dear old man saluted me. I'm quite as proud of it now as I was then, for he was a brave, good man and helped us in our trouble. The next slide is a Lafayette glove that was current in Boston in 1824. While in Boston, Lafayette also visited Harvard College twice. On the 29th, he visited John Adams at his home in Quincy, and on the 31st, he headed north, stopping in Chelsea, Lynn, Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Ipswich, and Newburyport for 7 events in one day in the rain, no less. Citizens of New Hampshire joined the frenzy surrounding Lafayette's visit on September 1, 1824, in Portsmouth. Although Lafayette proved to be a magnet for all Americans, veterans, particularly veterans of the American Revolution, hastened to greet him. September 1 was the day of Franklin Pierce's graduation from Bowdoin College in Maine. As Peter Wallner writes in his biography of New Hampshire's only president, Franklin had been selected to give the honorary oration in Latin and wrote his father, General Benjamin Pierce, hoping he would attend the ceremony. Wallner writes, in this he was disappointed, however, as the old general joined other Revolutionary War soldiers at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to honor General Lafayette, who was on his famous tour of the United States. So he dissed his son's graduation and valedictory address at college to see Lafayette. After visiting Portsmouth and returning to Boston, Lafayette headed west to Concord, to Lexington, Concord, and Worcester on his way back to New York City for his second visit there. In Lexington, a banner was hung on an evergreen at the entrance to Lexington Green. The next slide is that banner. You can't tell from the slide, which reads, "Welcome, friend of America, to the birthplace of American liberty." But that banner, which is still in the collection, or is in the collection of the Lexington Historical Society, is 39 feet long, 9 inches high, made of cloth with green paint. After Lafayette's departure, the Boston aldermen conducted an auction to try to recoup their investment in the furnishings they had provided for Lafayette's comfort. On September 14th, the city of New York gave Lafayette a spectacular fete at Castle Garden. This event set the standard for farewell tour events in other cities. Lafayette left New York again in September of 1824, headed west through New Jersey to Philadelphia before heading southward. He arrived at Yorktown in time to celebrate the 43rd anniversary of the surrender of the British Army on October 19th. He reached Monticello on November 4 and spent 10 days with Jefferson before spending a few days with James Madison at Montpelier. Lafayette spent much of the winter of 1824 in Washington City, making a number of side trips to Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Although his original intent was to visit only the first 13 states, he decided to accept the invitations from the other states and returned to Boston at the end of near the end of his trip to help lay the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. Thus, he left Washington City on February 23rd, 1825, for his southern and western campaigns. After stopping in places in Virginia and North Carolina, he entered South Carolina. In Columbia, the capital, an incident occurred that encapsulates this man who made no distinctions of race, color, or creed. In many of the southern states, local officials had decreed that slaves, as well as freedmen, should be kept away from all the public ceremonies and parades in honor of Lafayette, and the authorities in Columbia did the same. This was because of Lafayette's well-known reputation as an abolitionist. In an autobiographical sketch of Dr. Maurice Moore, who was a militiaman when Lafayette visited Columbia on March 11, 1825, he describes the following incident. This incident occurred after the public parade and militia review at a private reception at a private residence. Two sentinels with fixed bayonets on their guns were posted at the door to prevent the entrance of intruders. Officers, however, were allowed to enter unquestioned. Here I saw a strange but pleasant incident transpire. An old African, neatly dressed, came to the front door and started in. But the sentinels interposed their bayoneted guns to his entrance. The old man contemptuously pushed them aside, saying, "Shaw, Shaw, see guns afore you was born. Been where they been shot by soldiers too." And without further opposition from anyone, gained his way. He came straight to the room where the distinguished guest was standing among the crowd and said, "I come to see General Lafayette." Lafayette turned, looked at him, and remarked, "An old acquaintance. Don't tell me who it is." The Negro advanced to the Marquis and, bowing, held out his hand and said, "Howdy, Master Lafayette. How you do, sir? You remember me?" "Yes." "Stop. Don't tell me your name." "Ah, I have it. Pompey, belonging to Colonel Buchanan, the first servant who waited on me when I came to America. When I landed in Georgetown, I was taken first to the camp of General Buchanan near there, and Pompey waited on me," said he, as he warmly shook the old man's hand. The nobleman called for a glass of champagne with Pompey, which that worthy took with great dignity. Then he put out his hand and said, "Goodbye, Master Lafayette. We're getting old. We'll never meet again. God bless you." They shook hands again. Pompey went out, mounted his pony, and started for his home near Winnsboro, saying he'd come to see General Lafayette. Now he'd done that, he was going home. By the way, those Southern municipal officials were right to be concerned about Lafayette's influence on African Americans. Lewis Hayden was an enslaved boy in Lexington, Kentucky, when Lafayette arrived in May of 1825. In a memoir, he told this story. Lafayette was in full march under the town militia. I went a mile to meet them and found the fences lined with people. Lafayette was in a barouche drawn by 4 horses, and he passed the people. As he passed the people, he bowed to them on both sides. When he passed me, he bowed to the fence I was on. I looked around and saw no one on the fence. And what did I do but roll right down to the ground, frightened almost to death? As I did so, it was "Come foot, help body," for I never stopped running until I got under the guns that were to fire the salute. Lafayette was the most famous man I had ever heard of, and you can imagine how I felt, a slave boy, to be favored with his recognition. That act burnt his image upon my heart, so that I shall never need a permit to recall it. I date my hatred of slavery from that day, and I tell you that after that, I allowed no moving thing on the face of the earth to stand between me and my freedom. Lewis Hayden moved to Boston. His house, he and his wife Harriet's house is on the Boston African American Freedom Trail. He was a very rebel-rousing abolitionist in the 1840s and 50s. After the Civil War, he became a politician. He worked for the government as well. Lafayette's goal was to arrive in Boston in time for the Bunker Hill dedication, which he did. On that day, there were 45,000 people. Lafayette, he helped lay the cornerstone of the monument. Then the 10,000 were seated in a structure that was a circular structure, an amphitheater that was created to hear Daniel Webster's speech. Lafayette was seated in an armchair in front of them, just in front of the surviving veterans of the American Revolution. During his speech, Webster said famously, "Heaven saw fit that the electric spark of liberty should be conducted by you from the New World to the Old." After his second trip to Boston, Lafayette made a second trip to New Hampshire, this time to the capital city of Concord. By the way, there was a banquet on the State House lawn for 700, including 200 veterans. General Pierce was the host for the 200 veterans, so he really didn't have to diss his son's college graduation, although he did not know at the time that Lafayette would return. So after leaving Concord again, Lafayette headed east to Maine on June 23rd, 1825. That was the 23rd state that he visited. And then he headed west through Concord and through a number of Massachusetts towns on the 27th. On the 27th, he spent the night in Claremont, New Hampshire, which is on the border, on the Connecticut River. He departed on the morning of the 28th of June in a basket wagon belonging to Dr. Leonard Jarvis. They traveled, I'll show you the basket wagon, which is the next slide. This wagon carriage still exists. It's in the collection of the Long Island Museum. It used to be called the Long Island Museum of Art, History, and Carriages. They have a big carriage barn. It was donated by a descendant of the Jarvis family of Claremont, New Hampshire. So they they traveled north along the Connecticut River to the town of Cornish. There, New Hampshire relinquished its precious cargo to the authorities of Vermont, the 24th state that Lafayette visited, which he entered by crossing the bridge to Windsor, Vermont. After Vermont, Lafayette traveled back to New York City for his final visit there. As he left New York on July 14th, a militia unit that had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette and his service in the French Revolution in the Parisian National Guard saw him off. The next slide is a poster based on a painting commissioned by the U.S. National Guard in 1989, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, and it shows Lafayette bidding farewell to that militia unit. In the background, that arch says ferry to Hoboken. They're on the Hudson River. The legend of that poster, which you can't see in the slide, tells this about this farewell, and this is the militia unit that had named itself National Guard, and it says that by the end of the 19th century, every state militia unit in the country had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette, and that's why it's called the U.S. National Guard today. Like Churchill in World War II, Lafayette lived in the White House in August and September of 1825. On September 7, 1825, President John Quincy Adams sent Lafayette home aboard a new frigate named the Brandywine in honor of Lafayette's service in the American Revolution and at the Battle of the Brandywine, where he was wounded, thus shedding his blood for America's cause. In his journal, Levasseur chronicles Lafayette's visits with his old friends John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, and his new friend Andrew Jackson, whom he met at a rooming house in Washington in 1824. And through Levasseur's eyes, we get glimpses of the characters of these early American leaders. Jefferson is the ever-gracious host. Levasseur comments on the, quote, good appearance and cheerfulness of the Negroes of Monticello as attesting to the humanity of their master, but elsewhere describes slavery as a crime against humanity and advocates for the education of Blacks and gradual emancipation, reflecting Lafayette's well-known views. At Jackson's home in Tennessee, Lafayette is shown pistols, which he had given Washington in 1778 and had been given to Jackson recently by a Washington descendant. When Lafayette recognizes them and comments that he, quote, felt true satisfaction in finding them in the hands of a man so worthy of such a legacy, Jackson blushes and, quote, his eye gleams as on a day of victory. Levasseur also tells the story of the toll taker on the Potomac River, which is one of my favorite stories in the book. So it's August 6, 1825. Lafayette's living in the White House. He comes down to breakfast, tells his host, John Quincy Adams, I'd like to pay respects to your predecessor in Virginia. And Adams says, I'll arrange an expedition. An hour later, there are 2 or 3 carriages with about 8 or 10 people. They cross they come to the toll bridge to cross the Potomac. The president gives the toll taker the fare, and they're crossing the bridge, and they hear a clatter behind them. It's the toll taker screaming, Mr. President, you're 11 cents short. The next scene is the Adams and the toll taker counting carriages, counting people, and during this process, the toll taker recognizes Lafayette and says, oh, I'm not going to take a toll for Lafayette, the nation's guest. And President John Quincy Adams says, no, I insist. We're on a private visit to see a friend. They keep counting. Sure enough, he was 11 cents short. He pays the toll and they continue. And Levasseur, the author, says, it is ironic that the only time on this 13-month trip when a toll was paid for Lafayette was in the president of the head of state, a circumstance which in any other nation would have surely conferred immunity on him. While in America, Lafayette was the first foreigner to address a joint session of Congress and was addressed by Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who called him a faithful and fearless champion of liberty. Congress voted Lafayette a national reward of $200,000 and 23 acres of land in northern Florida. He was one of the earliest travelers on the Erie Canal in 1825 as he returned from the West to Boston. Lafayette died on May 20, 1834, and was buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris in soil from Bunker Hill that had been shipped to him in 1829. President Jackson gave Lafayette the same military honors as John Adams had ordered on Washington's death. America mourned. There were eulogies in churches and state legislatures and in private societies. On December 31st, 1834, John Quincy Adams, now a congressman, gave the official eulogy of the United States. So what was the significance of the farewell tour? First, Lafayette's arrival in the United States in August 1824 pacified the young country, which was in the midst of a vitriolic election campaign. We don't do that anymore, do we? The 5 candidates in the race included Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. This was the first presidential election with not a single candidate being a member of the revolutionary generation. The November election was so close that it ended up being decided in the House of Representatives in February of 1825. Lafayette's mere presence led to a temporary truce, if not a complete cessation of electoral hostilities. According to Lafayette's private secretary, Levasseur, for nearly 2 months, all hostilities, as well as all the emotions excited by the election, were forgotten, and one could only think anymore of Lafayette and the heroes of the Revolution. There were 2 reasons for this. One was the sense of patriotism that Lafayette's presence inspired in Americans. The other was that news of Lafayette crowded the rancorous political columns off the front pages of the nation's newspapers in many cases, and provided a heady dose of alternative news. Second, Lafayette's 13-month visit restored a sense of pride and patriotism in a new generation on the cusp of the Jubilee year 1826. The welcoming speeches across the country dwelled on the improvements in agriculture, commerce, population growth, the arts, and education. In his replies, Lafayette spoke admiringly of the progress he observed throughout the nation. The Americans attributed these successes to the Republic, which Lafayette had had a major role in founding. One New Hampshire Freemason, and to Lafayette himself, one New Hampshire Freemason went so far as to exclaim with perhaps some slight exaggeration, "Whatever is lovely or exalted in the social and political conditions of America, we contemplate with enthusiasm as the monument of your virtues." The repetition of these themes all over the country, which were reported widely in the public press, engendered a strong current of renewed patriotism throughout the land. As Lucy Penhallow of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, wrote after meeting Lafayette at a ball, "Meeting Lafayette was one of the happiest moments of my life. Being able to thank him personally for his service to America," she wrote, "made one feel 10 times more of an American than I did before." Third, the farewell tour set up a naming frenzy, as well as the erection of numerous, over 20 Lafayette statues and monuments. We've already talked about the cities and towns and streets, but there are also numerous schools named for Lafayette, and about 75 Masonic lodges are called Lafayette Lodge as a result of the farewell tour. Finally, Lafayette's tour solidified Lafayette's role as the go-to symbol of Franco-American friendship. Did you know that the inspirational spark for the Statue of Liberty was lit in the 1860s when Edouard Laboulaye, who no one in America knows who this man was, the principal promoter of the enterprise, and Frederic Bartholdi, its sculptor, discussed how the Americans honored Lafayette and the French volunteers as much as they honored their own patriots? Did you know that the principal address at the 1886 inauguration of the statue, given by Peekskill, New York orator Chauncey Depew, was essentially a biography of Lafayette? Mr. Depew began his oration this way: "The story of Lafayette's life is the history of the time which made possible this statue, and his spirit is the very soul of this celebration." He continued, "The alliance with France during the American Revolution assured our triumph, and Lafayette assured the alliance." Even in modern times, during every state visit of a French president, Lafayette and his role in the American Revolution are referenced repeatedly in speeches and toasts. One enterprising member of the American Friends of Lafayette calculated that when President Trump hosted President Macron, the two presidents referred to General Lafayette 20 times, and Vice President Pence mentioned him once. I will end this talk with an obituary, not of Lafayette, we'd be here another half hour at least, but of an obscure Philadelphian by the name of David Kramer. Mr. Kramer died in Philadelphia during the blizzard of 1888. He didn't die as a result of the blizzard. The obituary starts in all caps quote, "A man who knew Lafayette dead." David Kramer died on Monday evening, the 12th, after several months' illness of a complication of diseases in the 73rd year of his age. He many years ago resided in Philadelphia, where he was a contractor and erected many fancy dwellings for the leading men of the city. He was a member of the F&AM, the Freemasons, Carpenters Association, which was a very high-end guild in Philadelphia, and the IO of OF, the Oddfellows, and at one time was an active member of the city council. A very accomplished man, you might say. In his youth, and here's the buried lead, I guess, in his youth, he had the pleasure of seeing and conversing with General Lafayette during his last visit to America. Well, if you do the math, David Kramer, a successful builder and city councilor, was 9 years old when, with 5,000 other school children, the newspaper account says 70 schools with 70 students each, met General Lafayette outside Independence Hall on October 4, 1824, and that was apparently the most important event of his very accomplished life. Thank you for your attention.
Mr. Hoffman will now entertain questions presented by Deb Thompson, Regent of the Octorara chapter of the Daughters of American Revolution, and a member of our Lafayette 200 Lancaster Western Chester County Planning Committee. Debbie, thanks for joining our broadcast.
Thank you for having me. I have some questions for this evening.
Before you go on, I just wanted to answer one question that came up during Alan's presentation that is not Lafayette related, and that was some people were seeing their screen as small. When we broadcast our webinars, we broadcast in full screen. The size of the screen is totally dependent on what the attendee has checked on their screen. And in the top right-hand corner, there is a full screen button. So for future webinars, attendees can click that button and they will see a full screen rather than the small screen if that's what they were seeing.
Right. Tonight, Alan, the first question comes from a young lady named Wendy. She said life expectancy for a Frenchman in 1825 was 39 years. You said that he was portly, and as we know, he walked with a limp. He endured 5 years in prison in Austria and Prussia. 13 months of travel must have been exhausting. How did his health hold up on the farewell tour?
Remarkably well. He was indefatigable. In that entire book, there's only one time that he has an upset stomach, period, in the entire book. But, you know, just to give you an idea, that day, on August 31st, he visited those 7 towns in the rain, and each place he had to stop. They'd feed him, they'd have a speech, you know, that type of thing. So he was late for his 7th stop in Newburyport. And they wanted to give him another banquet, but they deferred, and the next morning they gave him some food. So then he goes and spends the whole day in New Hampshire, stopped in 4 towns before he got to Portsmouth. And again, it was raining again. He left the ball that Lucy Penhallow talks about at about 10 at night. And he arrived in Newburyport again, which is about 15, 20 miles in the AM, stopped briefly. And then he was in the carriage all night. He arrives in Boston 7 or 8 AM, freshens up for an hour or two, gets in the carriage and heads for Lexington. I mean, it was incredible. He had an amazing energy.
Okay. Our second question tonight comes from Barbara. I'd like to explore a list of Revolutionary War veterans who met with Lafayette during his journey. I'm sure that that's difficult, but was guessing that the list of veterans at Bunker Hill commemoration might be possible. Is it?
I'm not sure whether it is or it isn't. I would suspect that it's not. But what you find is that, for example, in Tos, a lot of the people who attended the banquets were Revolutionary War veterans. I mean, you can construct a list, but I don't believe there is a list per se of veterans.
Okay. The next question is, what is the name of the Maritime Museum in Maine with the Cadamus painting?
Yes, the Cadamus painting. It's called the Penobscot, Penobscot Maritime Museum. I think it's in Penobscot, Maine, actually. It must be. Yeah.
Okay. And I've got a question here from Michael. I've recently been reading more about the War of 1812 and realizing that the young USA relationship with Britain and France, our neighbors to the north, Canada, were complicated and fraught with tension, both abroad and domestically, between Democrats and Republics, and Federalists who preferred different countries in the French and British conflict. Was Lafayette's visit seen as having any important or significance on issues of domestic and international politics, or was it largely focused on his own personal contribution and character? Churchill's visit in the post-premier years, and especially his speech in Fulton, Missouri, were full of importance for the U.S. and U.K. relationship and the politics of the Cold War.
Yeah, I would say the latter. There were no, to my knowledge, foreign policy implications at that time of Lafayette's visit. You have to, the period from the beginning of the Revolution to 1815 was fraught with respect to relations between America and Great Britain, and relations during certain periods with France, especially under Napoleon. But there was no war going on in the 1820s. What you saw instead were revolutionary movements, like in Spain, for example, and Greece. And there was a general consensus among Americans, French, and Britain. Well, not so much the French, America and Britain on those issues. In France, they came to the defense of the Bourbon king of Spain during the Spanish Revolution. Lafayette was opposed to that, but he didn't get involved in the way Churchill did, certainly. But in the toasts and in the speeches, there was all kinds of talk about the revolution, supporting the revolution in South America, in Spain, and in particular in Greece. That was a big issue in 1824 and 1825.
Okay. Wendy's asked another question. How was Lafayette able to persuade the court of Versailles to send millions of dollars and thousands of elite troops to the Continental Army when Louis XVI was miffed at him for going to the colonies in the first place?
Well, that ire that Louis XVI had evaporated, because when Lafayette, he was in full support of the policy when Lafayette returned, of trying to limit British reach in North America and elsewhere. So Lafayette, when he returned in early 1779, was a hero in France. He was a hero to the King and Queen of France, to the ministers, to the people, and he had a lot of influence. He wrote a memorial in July of 1779, in which he proposed, in essence, what came to be the Rochambeau mission, with the 5,000 or 6,000 troops and a small fleet. And they basically accepted his recommendation, except for the fact that he wanted to lead it. So they said, no, we want a more experienced general to lead it. You go back and rejoin the American Army and go tell Washington that Rochambeau is coming with troops and a fleet.
Okay. Okay. Bonnie Weiss is informing us that in Jeffersonville, Indiana, a man named Zalman Burt came to see Lafayette on May 12th, 1825, and his descendant has come forward and will be part of the celebrations this year.
That's great.
Benton Weber has asked, when Lafayette visited Lancaster, he traveled in a group of 3 barouche carriages. Do they still exist? There's
Whoa.
one reportedly in Pennsylvania, and I wonder if there's an existence or location that have been verified.
I do not know about those particular carriages. There are carriages in Boston, Roxbury. The carriage that brought Lafayette from Rhode Island to the governor's mansion in Roxbury still exists, and it's been restored. There's a carriage in Situate, Massachusetts. The Studebaker Museum has a carriage, but I don't know that any of them. Well, I know the first wasn't from Philadelphia, from Pennsylvania, but maybe the Studebaker carriage could have been from Pennsylvania.
Okay, and I have one last question. Well, I have one more question here. How did you become so interested in Lafayette?
I guess I read a book. That's how it started. I read a book in 2002 called, well, I was always interested in American history. I loved early American history. In college, the last 2 years, I just took early American history courses. But I read a book called America's Jubilee in 2002 by Andrew Burstein, and it was about the 50th anniversary of the country. The whole first chapter, which was about 1/8 of the book, was about Lafayette's farewell tour, and I had never heard of it, notwithstanding my immersion in early American history. And I said, what was all the fuss about? And one day I was a lawyer. I was taking depositions in New York, staying with my brother-in-law. He said, this was September 17th, 2002. I checked this out on my billing records. What do you want for your birthday? And I said, Neil, you're late. I kind of tease him. And he said, no, I'll get you something. So I said, get me a book about Lafayette. He came back with 2. One was the then current biography by Unger, and the other one was a wonderful catalog of a 1989 exhibition that traveled to 3 museums with 3 wonderful catalog essays. And I was hooked at that point. I wanted to read everything I could find about Lafayette. Ultimately, I wanted to read the Levasseur's account. I couldn't find it in English at the time. There had been an English translation in 1829, but I found it in French, bought it at the Brattle Bookshop in Boston, brought it home to my wife, showed it to her. She's very fluent in French, not more so than I. And she opens it up. She says, it's in French. What are you going to do with it? And I said, I'm going to translate it. And she said, I hope you're not going to ask me to help. I've got a life. So it took me 2 years to do the translation, and then another year to get it published. So, and then during those years, I found out about the Massachusetts Lafayette Society and the American Friends of Lafayette.
Okay. Do you want to tell anyone how that an individual can purchase your book?
Well, there are several ways. It's on Amazon. There is also an ebook, which is on Amazon, but also on a company called Book Babies. I have a distributor that's called Pathway Books. That's another way. And I am able to sell and ship books from my house. So if you want it personalized, I can do that as well.
And it looks like we had one more person. And is the lapel pin available for purchase?
Yes, in this respect, you have to join the American Friends of Lafayette. Then you
So
get
the answer to that question is no. You have to join our American Friends of Lafayette.
That's what I say. Yes, you have
And
to
you
join.
and you can join the American Friends of Lafayette at Lafayette200.org.
Or the other website too.
Friendsoflafayette.org.
Yeah. And you should all join, everyone who's on this call who isn't a member.
Well, if you do join, you get special invitations to Lafayette events, seminars like this, and a wonderful welcome package chock full of Lafayette related items.
Including the pick.
Oh, let me see here. somebody popped in, already joined. All right. Do you have any closing messages you would like to send out to everyone tonight?
Well, just that, I got into Lafayette in 2002. And, as the years passed, I learned more and more. And I continue, my kind of respect for him as a human being and all he stands for continues to grow. And it's at its zenith today. And I just think he was one of the greatest individuals in our history. And I like to tell this story. In Union Square in New York, there are 4 statues of 4 great men, and they're facing each other. There's Washington facing Lincoln, one end to the other, and Lafayette facing Gandhi. And I strongly believe that Lafayette belongs in that group.
Alan, we salute you and extend a huge thank you for your exceptional presentation this evening. Our appreciation also to you, Chuck and Debbie, for your kind assistance with this broadcast. Tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be made available for later viewing on our YouTube channel, Lafayette 200 Marquis Mondays. We hope you enjoyed our program this evening and invite you to attend our next Marquis Monday, which will take place on Monday, January 20th, with Diane Shaw, author of the book, A True Friend of the Cause, Lafayette and the Anti-Slavery Movement. Until then, bonsoir. Good night, everyone.